history bears witness to pivotal moments when the world, as it was known, irrevocably changed. One such moment was an invasion, heralded by ominous signs in the heavens. In 793 AD, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, truly terrifying omens appeared over the lands of Northumbria, striking deep fear into the local population. The sky seemed to open up, revealing unprecedented phenomena: immense whirlwinds, blinding flashes of light, and ominous, fiery images resembling flying dragons. These mystical occurrences, as if prophesying an impending catastrophe, preceded a dreadful event. On June 8th of that same year, merciless barbarians descended upon the holy sanctuary of Lindisfarne, the Church of God, perpetrating unimaginable devastation, plunder, and slaughter. It was from this day, marked by the unholy attack, that the Viking Age literally burst into the annals of history, forever altering its course. The image associated with these northern invaders was that of bloodthirsty predators, comparable only to wild wolf packs, showing no mercy and terrorizing peaceful inhabitants, especially those devoted to serving God. Their arrival was as sudden as it was devastating, like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. Within a few years, their terrifying reputation spread throughout the Christian world, instilling genuine dread. Soon, the names of their homelands, Danes, Scandinavians, Norwegians, or simply Norsemen, became virtually synonymous with pirate, carrying a threat and foreboding disaster. The era that began with their appearance was characterized as a brutal, explosive assault of anti-Christian paganism. These formidable seafarers, arriving on their magnificent ships, glided across the waves like storm clouds approaching from the north, first appearing in small but deadly raiding parties, then in powerful fleets capable of crushing any resistance. These enigmatic and formidable warriors, known to us as Vikings, originated from the harsh lands of northern Europe, from the vast region of Scandinavia, encompassing modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Jutland, the northern part of Denmark. Although they might have borne various tribal or regional names in their homelands, to the rest of the world they collectively became known as Vikings, a symbol of imminent threat. Even before the horror of Lindisfarne, in 789 AD, an event occurred on England's southern coast that was to be the first ominous harbinger of the coming upheavals. A reeve of King Beorhtric of Wessex, accompanied by a small group of loyal companions, hurried to Portland to investigate the appearance of 3 suspicious ships, which were initially presumed to be merchant vessels. However, to his and his men's great misfortune, these ships carried not goods, but death. Bodeg became the first documented Viking victim on English soil. He and his companions were mercilessly slain, and as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle chillingly notes, these were the first ships of the Danes to come to the land of the English. After this initial, highly disturbing encounter, for the next 4 years, nothing more was heard of these barbarian foreigners from the north, which perhaps fostered a false sense of security. But it was merely the calm before the storm. Soon after, they swiftly invaded, delivering a blow that shook the Christian world to its very foundations with the plundering of Lindisfarne, that very holy island. From this moment, a point of no return, and for the next 3 centuries, the Vikings never vanished from history. Their presence was felt everywhere. In the pages of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, countless mentions can be found of ceaseless waves of Viking raids crashing upon the lands now known as the British Isles. This was not merely an isolated incident, but a true endemic problem, a constant menace that could not be eradicated. Once it became clear to the northern warriors that easy pickings awaited them in Britain, and some local kings, in desperation, even paid them tribute just to leave by season's end, these islands became a favored and regular target for their plunder. But what is astonishing is that such treatment was not reserved solely for the inhabitants of Britain. Later in history, we find evidence of Viking fleets making their way through the Mediterranean Sea, reaching the distant shores of Sicily and even Constantinople itself, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. And there, within the walls of Hagia Sophia, that magnificent cathedral now serving as a mosque in Istanbul, directly above the gallery of the enormous dome, knife marks are etched into the marble balustrade, declaring, "Gudric was here." This Gudric, a kind of 9th century Vandal, was a rough individual, embodying the spirit of many of his contemporaries and future generations, who was evidently bored by the religious service being conducted below. He pulled out his dagger and boldly immortalized his name on the sacred building, leaving a testament to the unyielding Viking spirit. This event, like many others, became part of the grand period now known as the Viking Age. Unstoppably moving south, the Vikings not only conducted raids but also established permanent settlements, consolidating their presence in the Orkney and Shetland Islands. turning them into their strongholds. Their expansion led to the colonization of vast territories in Scotland and Ireland, where they left an indelible mark on the culture and genetics of the population. They invaded and conquered a significant portion of England, stopped only by the resistance of the sole ruler whom the English respectfully named the Great, Alfred of Wessex, whose steadfastness became legendary. But their ambitions were not limited to Britain. They attacked and settled lands in France, advancing deep into the continent via the Loire River. Their swift ships reached the shores of the Iberian Peninsula, where they captured major cities such as Lisbon, Cadiz, and Seville, sowing fear and destruction. Moving further east, they plundered prosperous Pisa, leaving a trail of devastation. Some of these brave or reckless seafarers even reached Sicily, where they established colonies, intermingling with the local population. A separate branch, known as the Russ, or Swedish Vikings, forged their paths eastward, ascending the Fokhof River all the way to Novgorod, establishing a powerful commercial and political entity there. From there, some continued their journey overland, with incredible persistence dragging their ships on pine rollers to the source of the Dnieper River. Then, floating down the river, they reached Kiev, and further on, the Black Sea and legendary Constantinople, where, astonishingly, the Byzantine emperor's personal guard consisted mainly of these northern warriors. Others, from Novgorod, traveled east along the Volga, reaching the Caspian Sea and even distant Baghdad, establishing trade and cultural connections. Novgorod and Kiev, both Viking-founded kingdoms, were situated at the crossroads of some of the wealthiest trade routes of the then-known world, controlling vast flows of goods and influence. The Rus left behind not just a trace, but a lasting and indelible legacy in the form of their name, from which, as is known, the name of the great power, Russia, originates. Steering their longships westward, the Vikings demonstrated not only martial prowess but also the incredible courage of explorers. They successfully colonized the harsh but alluring lands of Iceland, and then Greenland, where the legendary Eric the Red established a thriving colony at Brattle, paving the way for future settlers. But their thirst for discovery knew no bounds. From Greenland, they continued their audacious journey even further west, reaching the shores of Vinland, a territory now part of Newfoundland, as well as the lands known today as New England in the United States. This momentous event occurred around 1000 AD, a full 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus is commonly believed to have discovered America. Thus, the Vikings became the first Europeans to reach North America around 1000 AD, when Leif the Lucky, better known in history as Leif Erikson, founded a colony named Vinland on the lands of modern-day Newfoundland, leaving an indelible mark on the history of transatlantic voyages. Viking raids, like lightning bolts piercing the night, plunged the entire Christian world into unspeakable terror. The speed with which they appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as swiftly was so astonishing that some contemporaries genuinely believed such feats were impossible without the aid of dark, demonic forces. Thus, to their already established reputation for wild, untamed brutality was added a mysterious aura of magic and the supernatural, which, incidentally, persists to some extent even today, shrouding the image of Vikings in an air of mysticism. But do they deserve solely the reputation of a soulless gang that roamed the seas, interested only in easy plunder and unrestrained pillaging? Undoubtedly, the Vikings were cruel and brutal warriors, and it cannot be denied that easy gains from coastal trade and wealthy, undefended monasteries attracted their attention. However, it should be remembered that this was a truly brutal era when Europe, having only recently experienced the fall of the Western Roman Empire, remained deeply fragmented. The continent was torn apart by endless political strife and internal conflicts, while from the south, there was constant pressure from Muslim forces from North Africa. In a sense, the Vikings were no more, but also no less, brutal than their contemporaries, operating in conditions where, in the 9th century, the vast domains of the Carolingian Empire in Western Europe and the English Empire had achieved a relatively high level of security and prosperity. These lands, having accumulated significant wealth, became a tempting target for numerous brigands whose activities were not regulated by the direct influence of Christianity. In reality, the European continent at that time felt pressure from 3 key directions. From the south came the Saracens, who, starting from North Africa, advanced up the Iberian Peninsula, then established themselves in southern Italy and southern France. The eastern frontiers were threatened by the Magyars, a group of Scandinavian origin who settled on the Hungarian plain and began pillaging immediately upon arrival. In the north and west, the Vikings dominated, carrying out their devastating sea raids on these territories. Notably, the Scandinavians themselves perceived this period as a golden age of unprecedented economic expansion, which profoundly influenced the commercial and artistic heritage of all Europe. Modern historical researchers have begun to reevaluate this phase, and some are inclined to see it as a powerful surge of energy originating from one of the few stable regions of Europe at the time. This period coincides with the so-called Dark Ages, from which very few written records survive, especially concerning the Vikings. Myth often masquerades as reality, legend is presented as undeniable fact, and the most captivating stories turn out to be the least reliable. In those times, the monopoly on literacy belonged almost entirely to the church. For example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was created at least 100 years after the events described by monks belonging to a powerful and uncompromising church that did not hesitate to resort to cruelty and falsehoods when its own interests were threatened. These documents are not objective historical sources. Rather, they are political and religious treatises intended to condemn those against whom they were directed. The Vikings, who worshipped non-Christian gods, posed a serious threat to their doctrine, and the Christian church could never take such a situation lightly. Other contemporaries saw the Vikings as not only a religious but also a significant economic and political threat. Merchants were forced to use coastal trade routes, the very same ones the Vikings actively utilized for their expeditions. Viking raids threatened the very survival of this coastal trade, and the general instability of power in Europe suggested that Scandinavia could well gain a strategic advantage over the Holy Roman Empire. The Roman Emperor regarded Viking aggression as a threat that could not be ignored. As his primary weapon, he chose religion. Being pagans, the Vikings were outside the church's sphere of influence, but if they could be converted, they would fall under the Pope's authority and, consequently, under his own control. The emperor cared little what methods would have to be used to subjugate the Vikings. For the Holy Roman Emperor, the Vikings posed two distinct but equally serious threats. Firstly, they presented an economic danger by intercepting trade routes through which the Holy Roman Emperor maintained contact and commerce with other peoples. Their violence on these routes threatened to cause severe economic disruptions for both the empire and Christianity in its then-established form. However, the Vikings also posed another threat, no less important to the emperor, and perhaps even more significant than the economic one. The Vikings were pagans. They did not worship the Christian God, and for this reason, their very existence was a challenge to the Holy Roman Empire. This had two different aspects. One, a threat to the doctrine of Christianity, but far more important was the threat to the emperor's own political power. Being pagans, they were outside the authority of Rome and, consequently, essentially beyond his own control. The emperor soon concluded that one effective way to counter the Viking threat was not so much direct military conflict as their conversion to Christianity. It was on his personal initiative that Christian missionaries began their activities in Viking lands. Geography profoundly defined their people and, ultimately, their place in history. The sea played a paramount role in their lives, being vital for both sustenance and communication. Both in Scandinavia itself and in the lands where they later settled, Viking society was built upon a clearly defined three-tiered social structure: jarls, also known as earls or warriors, carls, freemen/peasants, and thralls, slaves. Thralls constituted the working class of society and were never free. They were more like property, similar to a cow or a dog. Typically, thralls participated in military campaigns, piracy, or trade. They lived in a single cramped hut, built of wood, turf, or clay, together with their relatives and their animals. These unfortunate members of the community had no god to care for them, being abandoned to fate by both men and gods. However, compared to the treatment of slaves in other parts of Europe, the Vikings were apparently not overly harsh with their thralls. There is evidence that mistreating servants was considered shameful. Thralls were also permitted to own property and have free time to work for their own benefit, and under favorable circumstances, they could buy or earn their freedom. Most Vikings belonged to the Carl class. Their patron was Thor, the most revered of all Viking gods. Carls were small landowners and free people. Their status varied from destitute to the most powerful and wealthy. As free people, they supported a society based on the thing, assembly/parliament, for making laws. They also had the right to elect kings or make decisions about changing religion, as happened in Iceland in 1000 AD. Carls lived in two or more houses, which were a pair of long, parallel structures, sometimes supplemented by one or two stables, forming a complex of 3 or 4 buildings with an inner courtyard. In Viking settlements located on the Atlantic islands, dwellings were constructed primarily from dry stone, or a combination of turf and stone, and sometimes exclusively from turf. The interior was relatively simple. Fixed benches served as both dining areas and resting places. Clothing and personal belongings were carefully stored in chests or hung on special hooks. Food supplies were kept in wooden barrels and jugs, as well as in large bowls or pots. Floors were generally earthen, temporarily covered with reeds or straw. Above the hearth, located in the center of the dwelling, a cauldron hung from the ceiling, used for preparing broths or boiling meat. Iron griddles were also commonly used. Meat dishes were often roasted on a spit. Additionally, meat and fish were often cooked in earth pits, where they were wrapped in hot stones. Food was eaten with a knife, using a wooden cutting board. Drinking horns were used for beverages, although elegant imported goblets could be found in wealthy homes. The basic diet of the carls, or free farmers, was quite extensive and diverse. It included whole grain rye bread, oat and barley porridge, various fish, especially herring, lamb, goat, beef, veal, and pork. To this were added cheese, butter, and cream, as well as beer and mead. Wealthier segments of the population could afford imported wine. Whale, seal, and polar bear meat also played a significant role in their diet, especially in Norway and Iceland. Notably, boiled meat was often preferred over roasted. Vikings also expertly prepared hearty broths and preserved various types of meat and fish by drying. A special delicacy, still consumed today, particularly in Sweden, was surströmming, fermented fish. Among the most common vegetables were cabbage and onions, supplemented by wild berries and hazelnuts. Honey was widely used, primarily as a base for preparing mead. In regions far from the coast, a significant portion of food was obtained through hunting abundant game such as moose, deer, wild boars, and bears. Hares, geese, and chickens were also part of their diet, and in northern territories, reindeer and wisent. Jarls, or warriors, whose god was Odin, formed the ruling aristocracy. These were affluent individuals, endowed with power and high social standing, often claiming divine descent. They led a refined, sophisticated, and elegant lifestyle, enjoying residence in magnificent homes. Their distinction from the peasant class lay primarily in wealth, manifested in the number of their followers, the abundance of their jewelry, the number of ships, and the extent of their landholdings. Vikings chose their leaders based on their bravery, skill, and noble descent, and if a claimant asserted divine origin, any person could emerge as their chief rival. In the early Viking Age, monarchy as such was absent. This institution began to gain prominence only as individuals acquired power and wealth, but it became hereditary much later. Iceland, however, remained steadfast and completely rejected monarchy. From its very foundation, it was a republic governed by a confederation of chieftains. The aristocracy consisted of family heads who typically spent the long winter months at home, unburdened by daily affairs. Inscriptions about feast and jail largely reflect the customs and events that took place in the homes of the nobility. People who organized teams for exploration, trade expeditions, or pirate raids adhered to a specific way of life. A common annual activity for both the aristocracy and the peasants was cultivating the land in spring and autumn, undertaking expeditions in summer, and holding feasts in winter. Meanwhile, their wives managed the household, engaged in handicrafts, weaving, and protected family interests until their men returned with their plunder or goods. Land held colossal importance and bestowed social status. A family could strengthen its social standing through successful alliances, and marriages were often concluded for the sake of the dowry accompanying the bride. However, land always passed from father to the eldest son without division, which created a scarcity of quality arable land. In Scandinavian myths and sagas, we see the isolated and harsh life of most Vikings. Often, farmhouses were separated by many miles of horseback travel, and a traveler was unlikely to encounter another person. Travel conditions were extremely unfavorable, leading travelers through glacial wastelands and pristine lands. For half the year, daylight hours were short, and while summer could be warm but brief, long winters were harsh and perilous. The need for resources and the scarcity of land in many places meant that most farmers had to supplement their diet with the bounty of the sea. They are often described as farmers with boats or sailors with farms. Various reasons have been put forward to explain the Scandinavian exodus. Firstly, there was an acute need for land. The situation was exacerbated by the Viking inheritance system, according to which everything was inherited by the firstborn. Therefore, younger sons had to go in search of other means of livelihood. Secondly, fierce internal dynastic struggles were ongoing in Norway, especially when Harald Finehair came to power. This led many Vikings to leave their lands, which directly served as a catalyst for the formation of colonies in Iceland. A crucial aspect was family unity. Survival necessitated individualism and strong supportive family ties, especially during difficult times. Within the family, there were special relationships. The maternal uncle was primarily responsible for his nephew's well-being. Women provided the family with food and clothing, and both within the family and before the law, men and women held equal status and identical rights. Women, undoubtedly, held a significant place in the spiritual life of the Vikings, particularly in the practice of shamanism. These gifted individuals had the ability to enter deep trance states, communing with the unseen world of spirits to obtain vital information and answers to questions of paramount importance for the community's well-being, such as prosperity or marriage prospects. Not only the family circle but also strong bonds of friendship were vital for survival. Collective well-being often depended on the strength of social connections. Prudent clans purposefully cultivated close friendships, as large groups were significantly less vulnerable to adversity than small ones. This philosophy of mutual aid naturally fostered the development of hospitality. The sea element utterly dominated their daily lives. Scandinavians mastered the art of shipbuilding with perfection and astonishing speed, creating high-quality vessels. The pinnacle of their engineering genius and a distinctive symbol was the longship, drakkar. These ships, with their long, graceful hulls and elegantly curved prows, often adorned with fearsome dragon heads, were formidable weapons capable of striking terror into opponents. The Vikings developed an exceptionally reliable vessel, capable of navigating shallow waters and not requiring equipped ports for anchoring. The unique design of the longship allowed any coastal area to be used as a harbor and for easy maneuvering in waters inaccessible to most other European vessels of that era. It's no wonder their victims were completely unprepared, as the Vikings did not limit their attacks to islands or coastal settlements. They could ascend rivers to reach wealthy towns and monasteries, as was the case on the Thames, Shannon, and Rhine. Furthermore, these sea projectiles not only ensured the element of surprise but were also maneuverable enough to guarantee a swift retreat if necessary. The longship represented the most advanced model of shipbuilding of its time. These were magnificent vessels with specialized designs, capable of covering significant distances. Sometimes their fleets numbered hundreds of such ships. Historical records indicate that the fleets invading the northeast coast in 1066 during the first phase of the Battle of Hastings consisted of approximately 250 vessels, testifying to the colossal size of these naval armadas. During that period, one or two major naval battles occurred, especially as King Alfred of Winchester and Essex began to build his own fleet capable of confronting the Vikings on the open sea. He is known to have achieved one or two very hard-fought victories against them. For the Vikings themselves, their ships served three primary purposes. First, to transport them to the attack site. Second, to intimidate the populace with their famous dragon-headed prows. This was a powerful psychological impact rather than mere decoration, due to the terror they could inspire. And third, to carry away rich plunder after a successful raid. However, it was an insatiable wanderlust that truly dominated their minds. One could argue that the Vikings of that era were among the first to feel this urgent need to explore, to venture beyond horizons known to man. Despite their remarkable sea voyages, Vikings preferred to stay closer to the coast. Cooking required land. On the open sea, the crew primarily subsisted on dried meat or fish. There was little covered space aboard, and they slept in leather bags. Whenever possible, they preferred to set up camp on land and spend the night in the relative comfort of a tent. Sailing on the open sea was extremely risky, but most Vikings possessed sufficient astronomical knowledge to navigate by latitude. They maintained their course by observing the sun's position at noon, thus calculating their latitude by comparing it to other known locations. The Vikings were a multifaceted culture. They were farmers, skilled traders, and intrepid seafarers, as well as adventurers, buccaneers, and pirates. They possessed a distinctive artistic tradition that rivaled any in Europe at the time in its level and originality. Vikings had a particular love for ornamentation, and both men and women meticulously adorned themselves, decorating their clothing and bodies with exquisite pins, bracelets, and rings. Their art is a vivid reflection of their character, infused with an indomitable vitality and energy. It is characterized by richness of detail and filigree complexity, qualities shared by their poetry. Essentially, Viking art was a decorative art applied to a wide array of everyday objects, forming a core aspect of their existence. It is dominated by stylized animal depictions, ranging from quite naturalistic to complex abstract forms. Some of these works are strikingly beautiful, and their influence can be traced in the art of other European cultures, including Anglo-Saxon and Celtic. Almost anything could be adorned, and items decorated with gold filigree and their characteristic granulation bear irrefutable witness to the skill of Norse jewelers. Viking art is one of the most recognizable art forms in the world. It is vibrant, rich, energetic, and captivating. One could also say that in some cases it was ostentatious, and the Vikings, known for their austere approach to life and stern religion, seem to have poured all their positive energy into their art. Some of it is truly remarkable. Vikings decorated absolutely everything. Any surface could be embellished: clothing, ships, tables, cabinets, literally everything. Incredibly beautiful examples of Viking art, such as on church walls, and very beautiful carvings, still survive. Works demonstrating their exceptional skill have been preserved, but unfortunately, many others have been lost. In their art and decorative embellishments, the Norsemen reveal a vibrant, even dazzling, facet of their nature, which to some extent contradicts their established reputation. However, it is in the realm of spiritual beliefs that their true reputation is fully revealed. It is quite difficult to imagine Vikings as religious in the conventional sense. Much like their harsh landscape, their beliefs were rigid and unforgiving. Our knowledge of this religion is quite fragmented, as Christian missionaries who arrived in and established themselves in Scandinavia zealously eradicated any traces of the paganism they so deeply despised. Nevertheless, the names of the main Norse gods lived on, forever imprinted in the names of the weekdays dedicated to them: Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, as well as in place names like Thundersfield. We have received accounts of a loosely organized religion, devoid of a developed priesthood or complex theology, and relentlessly fatalistic, even foretelling a final judgment for the gods themselves. Unlike Christian myths, good did not inevitably triumph but was destined to meet its ultimate judgment. In this, it is not difficult to discern a reflection of the Viking character, people of reckless valor and unconquerable ferocity, more concerned with death and glory than with triumph. Their mythology was founded on an unambiguous reverence for violence, almost as an end in itself. It is difficult to grasp how such a belief system could have formed in the cold and harsh northern expanses, where success was measured not by conquering the elements, which undoubtedly would ultimately prevail, but by the ability to bravely face the final judgment. However, for followers, there was solace. Faith gave meaning to the universe, and they found protectors on earth. There was a god for those who lived by wisdom, another for those dedicated to war, one for the creator of runes, another for the smith, and so on. The gods were so benevolent that every devoted believer, regardless of which deity they worshipped, could be assured of complete protection in all their life's endeavors. Viking religion was certainly pagan. It was also inspiring, representing a blend of myths, sagas, deeply rooted beliefs, and a significant amount of fear. It was a faith, perhaps less burdened by complex theological structures. Warriors, driven by pure terror and fury, often stripped off their clothes, armor, and helmets, entering battle with their enormous swords or battle axes. They barely noticed the wounds they received. And it was this that made them so different from others, for they believed, like Japanese warriors in World War II, that a warrior who fell in battle went straight to heaven, or Valhalla, where an endless feast awaited him in the presence of the gods, reserved for brave warriors who had made their contribution on earth. Beside Thor, the most famous of the Norse gods, stands Odin, the grim and wrathful progenitor of all things, lord of the gallows, and patron of the Viking aristocracy. In Viking mythology, Odin was the supreme god, the father god, a complex deity who demanded human sacrifices. He bore about 170 different names, including Lord of the Gallows, Lord of the Slain, All-Father, and One-Eyed God. He was the god of battle, victory, trickery, and death. Odin was considered the chief god of the Vikings, but by no means the most revered. That honor belonged to Thor, the god of thunder, from whom Thursday gets its name. He commanded thunder and lightning, winds and rains, good weather and harvests. A sky and storm god, master of lightning, he appeared as a huge red-haired figure racing across the heavens in a chariot drawn by two sacred goats. He was a practical deity, revered by the common people. In temples where he and Freyr were worshipped together, there always occupied the central place of honor. Somehow, it is difficult to definitively determine the legacy of the Vikings. They appeared and very quickly faded from the historical record. In this short but extremely intense burst of energy, they entered history only to depart just as swiftly. However, if one looks at all they left behind, vibrant art, expressive literature, both had an influence far beyond their original borders. It can certainly be argued that Viking art continues to impact modern European graphic art. One only needs to look around to notice the influence of Viking animalistic forms, so their cultural heritage has not disappeared. Furthermore, one aspect often overlooked regarding the Vikings is their extensive trade activities. They not only raided and established settlements but also created a colossal trade system that spanned the entire known world at the time. Beyond this, they left us heroic myths and their undeniable influence on our own literature and epic sagas. And it must be admitted, in this sense, the world would be significantly poorer if the Vikings had never existed. This may seem like a humble legacy, but in the opinion of many, it is particularly important. Simply the image of a hero, a conquering hero who goes forth, confronts the elements, and triumphs. The advent of Christianity coincided with the decline of the Viking Age. Fear of this people diminished as they abandoned their traditional form of violence and adopted a form of cruelty more common to the rest of Europe. Although swift raids continued for several more years, Scandinavian monarchs gradually shifted to using large land armies, and by the end of their era, they ceased to be Vikings in the strict sense of the word. Were the Vikings exclusively pirates, or were they brave adventurers? Historical evidence strongly indicates that they embody both roles. These seafarers and explorers significantly expanded the limits of the known world, moving relentlessly north and west. In the course of their grandiose journeys, they not only discovered new lands but also created vast networks of interconnection spanning colossal distances. It was through their activities that previously isolated regions, particularly Ireland, were integrated into a complex and extensive global trade system. Beyond their commercial and exploratory achievements, they made significant contributions to the development of social institutions. The Vikings developed innovative forms of justice and governance, among which the unique jury system established in Iceland stands out. Equally noteworthy is the cultural legacy left by the descendants of the first Viking settlers, an extensive body of literary works that many authoritative scholars rightly consider among the greatest achievements of all medieval Europe. Their distinctive art spread far beyond their native lands, noticeably influencing neighboring cultures. In an astonishing burst of power and scale, the Vikings brought to the world a special heroic ethic and a unique way of life that for centuries served as a source of admiration and even envy for many subsequent generations. Regardless of how modern people view the Viking Age, it is impossible to deny. Through their vibrant and dynamic presence, they undoubtedly enriched world civilization.